Well, it's a joy to be with all of you. In this season of Great Lent, there's the fathers say there's actually three aspects of Great Lent that we really pay attention to. The first, of course, is our prayer for our relationship with God. The second is our fasting, where we try to hone in our own desires and to basically try to build up our own spiritual life. And the third aspect is that of almsgiving, our love towards our neighbor, which is, of course, showed when we help those who are in need. So I believe saying a few words about Alaska and the needs there during this Lenten season actually offers an opportunity for almsgiving that can really help. And for the fathers, almsgiving, of course, is one of the ways, a crucial way, that through some self-sacrifice of our own, we end up loving our neighbor, which is, of course, the great commandment, love of God and neighbor. And so that's very much kind of what I'm calling you to. Father Gregory, God-loving parishioners of St. Mark's Church, St. Paul once inspired the Christians of Rome to generosity by reminding them that it pleased those of Macedonia and Achaia to make a certain contribution for the poor saints which are in Jerusalem. And the church fathers saw it as only right that the Gentiles offer back what they could to those in Jerusalem, having received from the children of Israel the greatest gift of all, which is our Lord Jesus Christ. Today, we have the opportunity to hear that apostolic exhortation as it applies to our own Jerusalem, the mother diocese, the Diocese of Sitka, Alaska. So, just as St. Paul spoke of the poor saints which are at Jerusalem, I would like to speak to this blessed gathering about the impoverished Orthodox peoples of Alaska. Impoverished, yes, objectively, in terms of real-day present poverty, but also in terms of having unjustly suffered terrible trials and tribulations that are not frequently told outside of native homes and native communities. Some of these trials will be painful to look at, painful to hear, but look at them we must, for only then can we see both the dire need of our native Alaskan brothers and sisters, but also their genuine and often martyric heroism. Only then can we appreciate the miracle of the Orthodox faith still present in Alaska. Only then can we see how we're all being called as members of the body of Christ to be the Christian neighbor, the Good Samaritan to the Orthodox Church in America's oldest and most revered diocese, the Orthodox Diocese of Sitka, Alaska. In the presentation, I'd like to look at the Russian Orthodox mission, where we see the foundation that still remains firm, giving both strength and direction to those who remain faithful in the church to this day. Second, I would like to direct your attention to a series of setbacks or tragedies from which we can understand not only why the church in Alaska is as it is, but also what kind of help is needed to overcome those setbacks. Third, I'd like to consider the dire need of the Alaskan church in its present condition and suggest how this parish as a whole and you individuals faithful can be that Good Samaritan to your Orthodox brothers and sisters so that the Diocese of Sitka and Alaska can move closer to the path towards health for that wonderful mission that once bore such fruit to begin to bear fruit again by the grace of God through the help of the people of God gathered here together today. If there's a subdeacons present, you could actually pass out while I'm giving the talk both the icon cards and the envelopes and that to everyone who's present. Now, Alaska, as you see, is a rich and varied state in terms of geography, in terms of climate, in terms of cultures, and although for the sake of simplicity, we can refer to the primary native Orthodox Church in Alaska as one entity and the natives as one people, such a simplification often brings actually more confusion than clarity. There's still something distinctly native and still something distinctly Russian about Orthodoxy in America. But that native element has its own particular beauty and characteristics. We could make an analogy with Europe. Western civilization includes the 44 countries in Europe, but each people, the British, the French, the Germans, the Spanish, they have their own languages, their own cultures, their own strengths, their own weaknesses, their own problems, their own solutions, and to those problems. In like manner, we can speak about an Alaskan native church, but with the understanding that the Yupik, Unangan, Supyak, Athabaskan, Tlingit peoples and regions differ. The late Archbishop David used to say that he felt like he was the bishop of 5 dioceses. I would add 5 ethnic dioceses, which means each deanery has its own set of problems. Each requires a specific, unique solution. Now, I believe you are all familiar with that original ecclesiastical mission of 10 missionaries who were sent to Alaskan shores in 1794 by the Empress Catherine the Great, and how the missionaries stood up for the natives at the terrible abuses of the profit-driven Russian-American company. We know that the Russian missionaries fully embraced the Alaskan native mindset and the peoples as well. By adopting the people as their children and being adopted by them as their fathers, the missionaries of Alaska were able to teach and live an orthodoxy that became distinctly Russo native in tradition and practice. Orthodoxy was not experienced as a faith forced upon them from the outside, but rather as the perfect expression of who, as a people, they have always been, with their deepest values already manifest in the person and teaching of our Lord Jesus Christ. St. Herman, of course, is the ideal example of how to cultivate orthodoxy in Alaska by leading a prayerful life of complete devotion to God, by loving the faithful wholeheartedly, and demonstrating that love practically, establishing school institutions for social welfare and education, such as a school and an orphanage. And the result, the diary of one missionary reads, "The Lord be praised. We have baptized more than 7,000 Americans and have performed more than 2,000 marriage ceremonies. We love them and they love us." Parallel to this, wholehearted, zealous care of the church by the missionaries, and even prior to it, was the simple fact of the Russian fur traders, or promishleniki, marrying into indigenous families, naturally adopting their customs and their dress, while indigenous families would in turn adopt the Russian Orthodox faith. The intermarriage itself was very natural. The Russians, who were actually Siberians, and some of them, lived in cultures very much like Alaska, they already lived a subsistence lifestyle in harmony with nature, which is the lifestyle that was perfected by the first peoples of Alaska. But as these similar lifestyles are intermingled, so did the faith in which sacrifice and sharing were crucial. And so, being Orthodox, being Unangan, being Supyak, being Tlingit, being Yupik, being Athabaskan, and being Russian, all blended into a single Russo native Orthodox identity, in which no part of that identity was diminished or denigrated, but each element brought out the beauty already present in the other two. The people were linked by blood and united in the blood of Christ. This also would mean that undermining or attacking any part of this Russo native Orthodox identity would be equivalent to attacking it all. Looking back, this wedding of Russian Orthodox and native culture was a golden age of Orthodox missionary labors, on par with the spreading of the gospel by St. Paul himself. The generosity of those in the Church of Russia, from prominent figures from the Empress Catherine the Great, St. John Kronstadt, and many others, provided stipends for clergy, covered the cost of ecclesiastical items and books required for a full cycle of services, as well as the publication of books in their own native tongues. Through the continued generous support of the Imperial Russian Orthodox Missionary Society, the Orthodox Church in Alaska built cathedrals with 3 altars, an abundance of beautiful churches, bilingual schools attached to each church, orphanages, and means to provide for the poor in a tangible way. The Russian Orthodox Church was so aware of how crucial financial support was for this diocese that even with the sale of Alaska, they advocated for the local church, ensuring by treaty that various lands be allocated throughout the state to support that church. Through the labors of St. Innocent and the venerable missionaries thereafter, the natives' oral language became written ones, each with its own distinctive, adapted Cyrillic alphabet. The natives were given not only the linguistic tools to understand texts in Church Slavonic and Russian, but the means to translate with the missionaries many of those texts into their own language. In 1828, St. Innocent himself translated the Gospel of Matthew and frequently used prayers. Again, the generosity of the Russian Church supported these translations and publications. By the mid-19th century, Alaskan natives had become educated polyglots, conversant and literate in at least one native language, as well as Church Slavonic and Russian. In fact, Alaska was actually the most literate part of Russia, even more so than European Russia was. Some of our clergy, even today, remember as children singing from those original Yupik publications written in an adapted Cyrillic script. All of us know something about this period. We rejoice in it, claim it as our own, the first triumph of Orthodoxy in this land. Understanding the period that followed these years, however, is essential to understand your brothers and your sisters in Alaska today. And it's essential that we look at this history from the perspective of the natives, which is quite different from that of the dominant culture of those in the U.S. As many of you know, I've been outside of the United States for 25 years, and that's given me a certain distance from the culture of my birth, which I believe helps me to be open to the perspectives of those outside the dominant culture. Having approached Alaska with fresh eyes, I believe it's especially important to consider the perspective of the natives as uniquely theirs and as one that we need to adopt in order to help them in ways that they themselves understand as helpful. After many, many conversations with native clergy and faithful, I can see that they understand their history as being marked by three tragedies: the tragedy of the regime change in Alaska, the tragedy of the Bolshevik Revolution, and the tragedy of 21st century failures. The first tragedy is what Russians call the 1867 sale of Alaska, what those in the US call the purchase of Alaska, but what the natives experienced as a regime change that brought a very different approach to their culture, their language, and their personhood. After the Russian flag was lowered in Novo-Arkhangelsk, renamed Sitka at the time of the transfer, the respect and privileges as citizens that were accorded to the natives by the Russian government were not continued by the post-Civil War United States, whose main approach to Native Americans was that of warfare and restriction to Indian reservations that America's indigenous peoples interpret as nothing less than genocide. But to avoid the Indian wars in the lower 48, the United States federal government adopted a plan for the coercive westernization and acculturation of the Russo native population. Almost every native Orthodox Christian is familiar with Sheldon Jackson's promise to eradicate every trace of Russian Orthodoxy from Alaskan soil within 25 years. The natives were Christians, but they were the wrong kind of Christians. They were Russo native Orthodox Christians. From the natives' perspective, what followed was a cultural genocide of the worst form, as it was taking place in their very motherland, which meant if their culture were lost there, it would ultimately be lost everywhere, meaning total extinction. But from Sheldon Jackson's perspective, his was an enlightened choice. Quote, he writes, "We have no higher calling in the world than to be missionaries of our ideas to those people who have not yet reached the Anglo-Saxon frame of mind." What a stark contrast with the Russian Promyshleniki, who married those people as they were, adopting much of their culture. What a stark contrast with the Russian Orthodox missionaries, who brought Christianity and led the natives to conclude, as one native Aleut put it, "We Aleut people, we were always Orthodox. We just had to wait for Christ to come and show that to us." And so the Presbyterian minister, Sheldon Jackson, approached President Grant with a proposal for a United States choreographed Christian takeover of Alaskan territory. Tragically for the Alaskan Native, that proposal was approved. And now with federal sanctions and with Protestant missionary zeal, Russian Alaska was carved up into spheres of influence, and heterodox missionaries pursued a hostile campaign to convert the Native Orthodox peoples of Alaska to prominent American heterodox confessions. Again, anything was acceptable as long as it was not the Orthodox Church. For instance, the Presbyterians, and only the Presbyterians, were financed to religiously take over the Southeast. No other denominations were allowed in that area. The Baptists were financed to take over Kodiak, and so on and so forth, with government-supported mandatory Protestant mission boarding schools for the natives that were purposely established on what are our Orthodox strongholds: Sitka, my cathedral; Unalaska, the second cathedral; and Kodiak, the third historical, our cathedrals. The young students were not allowed to attend the Orthodox churches who lived in these cities, towns, in these settlements, and to receive the holy mysteries, even though that was their parents' desire. And so an unholy, unjust, and unfair war was unleashed, with Presbyterians preying upon the Russian Orthodox Klingits, Baptists preying on the Russian Orthodox Alutics of Kodiak Island, Roman Catholics preying on the Russian Orthodox Yupiks in the Yukon, and today Moravians preying on the Russian Orthodox Yupiks in the Kuskokwim, so on and so forth. This conversion took place by duplicity, bribery, and outright violence. The Jesuits who martyred St. Peter the Aleut in 1815 joined the charge in the Yukon in the 1890s, claiming that the Russians have left you under our protection, you are now ours. I have 10 parishes up in the north that are gone. They're Roman Catholic. The other parishes that I have in the Yukon region, most of them are 50-50, Orthodox and Roman Catholic. And that's also what I have in the Moravian region as well. The Baptists, they would literally rip the crosses off young Aleut children's necks and ask them to bring their parents' icons to them to be burned in exchange for a few pieces of candy. Native Russian Orthodox children were torn away from their families and culture for the purpose of Christianization. In 1873, a Supyak man and his small son were both imprisoned and fed on bread and water for 4 days because of the father's refusal to send his son to an American boarding school. In the end, he agreed to send his son, and they were both released from prison. Native mothers have told me they stole our babies and then gave them back to us as strangers to our ways and to our way of life. Some bravely held on to the faith, imitating our first native martyr, Peter the Aleut, but others were not strong enough. With tears, our Orthodox native mothers and fathers were forced to sign papers turning over their children to mandatory Protestant boarding schools in Alaska and the lower 48 for 5 years of indoctrination. In these schools, native practices, language, culture, and Russian Orthodoxy were ridiculed, suppressed, and forcibly replaced by a Euro-American culture and a particular Protestant worldview. Everything that made them distinct was to be destroyed. Natives, rightly proud of their fluency in multiple languages, were shamed for speaking Russian or their native tongues, often having to endure beatings and public humiliation. Protestant teachers would even use duct tape to tape shut the tender mouths of small native school children for daring to utter a word in Russian or their mother tongue. Jackson, the U.S. appointed General Agent for Education, argued that these practices were reasonable, since native languages were, in his words, stunted, barbaric, worthy of destruction, since they were useless for communicating with whites, inadequate for widening intellectual horizons, and the chief way that these natives remained bound to their primitive cultures and degrading customs. These are the very languages and the very cultures of the people that St. Innocent and our missionaries had honored, giving their language written form, and even encouraging the development of native literary works. This kind of fight continues to this day. I was, last year for the Feast of Dormition, I was at the village of Nustuyahok, and I had all the faithful gathered the way you're gathered today. And this man came to me, and of course there's always a public school. Usually it's Protestants who work there in order to also to missionize. Now Nustuyahok is a village of how many, Father Deacon, 700? 400? Of 400 people, everyone is Orthodox in the village. But the principal brought in these brochures, like the brochures I'm handing out, for a Protestant summer camp for the children of 2 weeks, where they will learn why it's wrong to make the sign of the cross, why it's wrong to honor the Mother of God, and they will have fun. And parents, who are like parents, are tired, and the opportunity to have their children, go away for 2 weeks. The children were taking the pamphlets home. Well, one man stood up and he said, "Vladika, I want to ask you something. When I heard this," he says, "it broke my heart to think of many of my grandchildren perhaps leaving the faith because of their participation in this. So I went to the school. I went and I found all of the brochures. I took all of them, I went home, and I threw them in the fire and burned them up. Vladika, did I do right or did I do wrong?" Now, during this time of the persecution, the diocese did strive to protect the native people with the Russian bishops of Alaska, though now stationed in San Francisco. So there's now a distance and they're not able to properly take care of the diocese, but they did object to the illegal sale of alcohol, as well as to the many temptations and vices brought to Alaska by the new settlers to the territory. But the diocese was also hampered at every turn, especially by the difficulty in receiving funding from Russia and repeated lengthy periods of time in which the diocesan see remained vacant. In 1880, Bishop Nestor appealed to President Rutherford Hayes about the absence of education for native peoples, but other than a polite reply from the president, nothing materialized, because they would send English teachers up there, but they told them they're stupid and you don't really have to teach them well. They don't really need to learn English, and certainly not enough to enter society. They just have to stop speaking their native languages and Russian. So he went and spoke to President Rutherford Hayes about the absence of education for the native peoples, but other than a polite reply from the president, nothing materialized. In 1888, Bishop Vladimir met with officials in Washington about the about the oppression of the Orthodox faithful, the inequality of rights between the local inhabitants and transplanted Americans, and the disregard for the church property guaranteed by the Treaty of Cession, but again with no positive results. Finally, in 1897, Bishop Nikolai wrote to President McKinley about the abuses of the Alaskan Commercial Company that had reduced the country's hunting and fishing resources to absolute exhaustion and the population to beggary and semi-starvation. With respect to the irrevocable guardian of Alaska, Sheldon Jackson, the zealous bishop wrote, "Alaska must be delivered of this man. By his sectarian propaganda, he has introduced dissension, enmity, iniquity, where those evils did not before exist. It is the Orthodox Greek Church which brought the light of truth to that country. Why then try to drive her out by every means, lawful and unlawful? The only thing that may be brought up against us is that we practice the true faith and have not yet divested ourselves of our sympathies for the land of our faith. But is that really sufficient ground for blame and persecution?" Again, his pleas were ignored, and the persecution continued with increased vehemence. Sheldon Jackson's plan, from his perspective, was a great success. In less than 2 generations, our unified native Orthodox population were religiously fragmented, culturally subverted, and an almost entirely Orthodox native population had been decimated, most exemplified in the Southeast. 90% of the Russian Orthodox Klingits became Presbyterians. 60% of the Yupiks became Moravians, Roman Catholics, and Baptists. 95% of the Russian Orthodox Athabascans became Protestants, and 50% of the Russian Orthodox Alutics became Baptist. Until the 20s, the natives, like blacks in the South and Indians in the West, were not considered real Americans, and they were even accused of being Russian nationals. And so, Alaskan natives, who were full citizens in Imperial Russia, were now considered to be ignorant barbarians, rightly deprived of the right to vote, and they underwent discrimination, not unlike the post-Reconstruction South. Cultural genocide was complete among those who left the Orthodox Church. But even for those who remained, they were not left without scars. Skills in their own native languages were lost without skills in English being acquired. Both the subtlety of expression and the extent of their native vocabulary were drastically constricted. Even today, indigenous peoples in all my parishes feel shame about not being able to speak well their own indigenous language because their parents would not teach them so that they would not be ridiculed the way they were when they were children. So with the sale of Alaska came the loss of their culture, the loss of their language, the loss of their dignity, and for many, the loss of their Orthodox faith. The deep pain and trauma of this experience in all Native communities was followed on a sociological level with an epidemic of antisocial, self-destructive behavior, suicide after suicide, in which mediating with alcohol and drugs plays an enormous role. For the Alaskan Native, the sale of Alaska was an indisputable tragedy. A tragedy for the people, a tragedy for the church, and a tragedy of leadership as the Russian Orthodox Church was not prepared to protect the faithful from the violent warfare unleashed upon the native flock so loved by Christ. The second tragedy to affect the good Orthodox peoples in the North is a tragedy of the Bolshevik Revolution that, of course, affected our entire church here in North America, but the difference in wealth and industry between Alaska and the other states in the U.S. meant that the repercussions in Alaska were even more severe. Bishop Philip, the Alaskan diocesan bishop at the time, was in Moscow for the All-Russian Church Council and never permitted to return to his flock. That revolution, which completely cut off the church in America from the Russian Orthodox Church, not only left the church in Alaska in a severe financial predicament, banks foreclosed on orphanages, no longer able to run without financial support of the Imperial Russian Orthodox Society, the seminary in Sitka was closed, valuable church properties were seized, the publication and translation of native Orthodox texts into native languages stopped, the number of priests in the diocese dwindled. The missionary period was over. This in turn left the native population defenseless in the face of the aggressive tactics of Protestant missionaries who continued to entice native children for a week of fun, fellowship, and instruction on the evils of our treasured icons and making the sign of our precious cross. In the meantime, the attention of the North American church, centered now in New York, was consumed by crisis after crisis involving the now more numerous parishes in the lower 48. And so the Diocese of Alaska was, as church historian Alex Liberovsky puts it, forgotten by the metropolia for the next half-century and left completely open to attacks from the heterodox and abuse from the U.S. federal government. During World War II, villagers in Attu and Atka had to watch the U.S. Navy burn down not only their old Russian Orthodox churches with bells gifted by the Tsar, but also their villages and their homes under the pretext of protecting U.S. interests from the Japanese. The Aleutians were then emptied of the Unangan Orthodox Christians, and they were taken as prisoners to the Alaskan southeast to be interned in concentration camps, worse than the camps in which the Japanese were incarcerated in during World War II. The Japanese could at least speak Japanese, but the Unangans were forbidden to speak in their native language or Russian, except in the little chapels that they faithfully built in each one of these camps, where they would worship the God of their fathers. Even further, natives in the Pribilofs worked as literally as slaves of the federal government until 1970s, fulfilling harsh quotas of seal pelts, killing and processing thousands of seals a day, forcing them to pay off the debt incurred from the purchase of Alaska, the purchase of their own ancestral lands bought by the U.S. government at the time of the sale. Federal agents forbade the use of Unangan in public. They censored their mail and tried to force the priests to conduct the services in English. They would even interfere in funerals, trying to prevent the faithful from giving the last kiss to their dead. By this point, the diocese was not in a position to defend herself or the first peoples of Alaska. And the larger Orthodox body were aware that these tragedies were even unfolding. The forgotten period ended with the tragic burning down of St. Michael's Cathedral in Sitka in January of 1966. Now the Church of Alaska came back to the conscience of the church located in New York. Renewed interest in Alaska was further bolstered by autocephaly granted to our beloved Orthodox Church in America. Again, there was a meeting of two cultures, the native Orthodox culture of Alaska and the American Orthodox culture of the lower 48, eager to offer support to the diocese in which Orthodoxy first reached our continent, but not necessarily prepared to listen to the voice of the native or to respond in a way respecting their unique Russo-native culture and the Russo-native cultural needs. Now, it was the diocese discouraging the use of native languages in Church Slavonic in favor of English in the only place where they still felt safe to maintain those languages and their culture. Until then, the church was even safer than their homes, as the church was the place where they were all united together as a people, a Russian Orthodox indigenous people. A newly established seminary did produce more native priests, but not necessarily priests equipped by the seminary to serve in the languages of their people or to encourage their local traditions. For many years, seminarians were required to learn the oboe musical system that was nowhere used in Alaska. In Alaska, they used the kevin, a form of the kevin system, but they've modified it a little bit. For many years, seminarian priests were discouraged from speaking Yupik in the presence of a hierarch or from singing in Yupik at the seminary liturgies and vespers. In this, the seminary was following the accepted diocesan practice. But given that the church was the only place in which it was safe to sing in Unangan and Slavonic or Yupik and Slavonic, these various diocesan seminary directives, explicit and implicit to use only English, took part of their culture from them, part of their heart, and many left the church not because of the language issue, but because this practice was in their minds a continuation of that of the U.S. federal government and the heterodox missionaries. The approach of St. Herman, St. Innocenti, and St. Yaakov were sadly forgotten. The third tragedy to affect the Alaskan church was a period of pastorally insensitive and oppressive church leadership in the 2000s that traumatized many of the clergy and nearly all the parishes in the diocese. Many native men did not feel ready or able to become priests, were pressured into accepting ordination, artificially enlarging the number to 50 clergymen, but ultimately leading to an unprecedented number of depositions and priests seeking laicization that continue even today. Furthermore, native clergy and faithful lived in fear of harsh church leadership to the point of trembling and tears from experience of being publicly berated and humiliated during the divine services. At the close of this period, many of the disillusioned natives turned away from the church. As one Yupik elder put it, "Our minds are broken, our hope is torn down. To see our priests cry, I cried with them, the light has gone out." Some of this damage is irreparable, as many of the faithful during that time have either opposed, apostatized, or simply want nothing more to do with the church that calls them pain. Only by considering these tragedies, the regime change, the Bolshevik Revolution, pastoral mistreatment, can we understand how the diocese has been like that man walking from Jericho to Jerusalem, attacked through no fault of his own by thieves and left half dead. Only by considering these tragedies can we understand in part why the diocese struggles with dwindling parishes, a shortage of priests, and a dispersed Orthodox population that does not attend church. Only by considering these tragedies can we understand why the additional interrelated problems of alcohol, drug abuse, unemployment, migration away from the villages are in fact magnified being even more devastating than they would be under other circumstances. And so we're left with a demoralized people, harmed by a government that never represented them, left without leadership and protection from the church that had given their ancestors such hope, and even abused by those from whom they expected to receive the love of Christ. From what I have now related, it should not be surprising that the most venerable parts of our sacred diocese are a shell of their former selves. I'm grieved to report on a Sunday none of the parishes in Kodiak Deanery, the home of St. Herman, have more than a handful of native parishioners over the age of 60. The same is true of St. Innocenti's Cathedral of Ascension in Unalaska, and many villages in the Yukon and Kuskokwim. And these are not the only regions where the church is suffering. Within the next 10 years, unless there is drastic change, the majority of these parishes will have to close and the cathedrals converted into museums. Currently, the Diocese of Sitka, Alaska has 20 active clergy, serving a diocese with over 80 active altars, but only 16 in distinct parishes, as many priests are unwilling or unable to be assigned to parishes that need a priest because of financial or family considerations. This means that being able to participate in divine liturgy every Sunday is not the norm for most of my diocese. Many parishes must wait months on end to see a priest and somehow survive on reader service called the obietnica, even though the absence of Holy Communion, Holy Confession, Sunday instruction means that there's no foundation for even the most elementary liturgical and spiritual life. The median family income for the state of Alaska is $77,000 per year, but the median stipend for my priest is $7,200 per year with nothing paid into the pension plan. A teenager working at McDonald's makes more than my chancellor. Some other comparisons can be seen in the PowerPoint slide. Obviously, it's not possible to live off such a salary or retire pensionless after such a salary. My priests and matushki must seek employment to support themselves and their families. Some of my priests have gone bankrupt, being unable to cover basic bills. This in turn means that they have less energy to devote to exercising their priesthood, that is necessarily limited to a Saturday night vespers, a Sunday morning liturgy with baptisms, weddings, and funerals on demand. There's neither the time nor energy for Bible studies, adult education, youth groups, and additional liturgical services. The well-funded heterodox, on the other hand, are able to provide all of these resources and more. I was at another village in the Yukon, and I couldn't meet. Of course, the church didn't have a hall. But Samaritan's Purse, maybe 4 years earlier, in this part Orthodox Moravian village, built their own church there, which is a beautiful hall. I had to have somewhere to meet with my faithful, so I met with them there. The Orthodox pastor and his wife, the Protestant pastor and his wife were there, and while I was talking, they were giving candy to all of the children. So, in addition to a wretchedly insufficient stipend, many villages do not have a rectory for the priests to stay in, and some of the villages with rectories provide shelters that are frequently uninhabitable. In Kwifluk, the village where Saintly Matushka Olga is, I went to the priest's home. There's two rooms. They have how many children, Father? 7 children, 2 rooms. One of the rooms is the kitchen, the dining room, the family room, and the other room is the bedroom. And because there is not enough room for all the children to lie down together at night, Matushka doesn't sleep at night. She stands up so the children can be can lay in bed, and then Matushka sleeps during the day. The Yukon Deanery doesn't have a single rectory for a priest. This means unless the priest already has a home in the village, he can't be assigned there. Put simply, our priests in Alaska are not financially being taken care of by the church, and the church in Alaska is not financially able to take care of the faithful. These problems at a parish level are mirrored on the diocesan level. Diocesan poverty is in fact a reflection of the poverty of the faithful, who financially struggle to procure costly basic staples in villages with 90% unemployment. In fact, when they do bake sales at the cathedral, the women use their food stamps to get purchased food to then sell them. A basic commodity, like a piece of cheese, can cost $25 in rural Alaska. If Matushka in rural Alaska buys some cheese and some milk for her children, she will have already spent 30% of father's weekly salary. In recent years, there's an emphasis on the spiritually beneficial practice of tithing. On a personal level, it's valuable. On a corporate level, it's markedly insufficient. I gave this talk one place and someone said, well, you know, even 10% of zero is still zero. So I realize that this is a gloomy picture, but I also believe that the fact that the cross St. Herman planted in Alaska is still there is nothing short of actually a glorious miracle of God. It's just, it's Golgotha, which makes the resurrection so very glorious. And I believe it's seeing the Golgotha of the native peoples and the fact that there are many villages that are 100% Orthodox. I went last year to the remote village of Atka, which is as far as you can go down the chain. You go a few more islands and you'll get to Russia. There's a village of about 40, I guess, and I went there. You know, it takes actually 2 flights, one from Anchorage in Alaska, and Alaska all the way down to the end of the village. The entire church, the entire village, you know, maybe 38 people, they were all in church for all-night vigil. They knew how to sing an all-night vigil, and they have not had a priest since 1892. Wow. And they sang in Anang and in Slavonic, and they sang it with all of their hearts. They believe they've been faithful because of St. Yaakov, because that was, of course, his island. My luggage didn't come, actually, with me. I brought with me the priest and Father Deacon, my luggage, because Episcopal luggage is always heavy with all our accoutrements. It was left in Alaska, so I wasn't able to serve on Sunday. I was there for, St. Nicholas Day, and I said, well, shall we have the priest serve again? And they said, no, we'll do everything we can to get that plane there so that you can serve. So we finally found out that the plane could come, but it would come at what time, Father Deacon? 11 o'clock, which meant that we wouldn't be able to, because we have to unpack and everything, we wouldn't be able to start Divine Liturgy until like 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So I found out this and I said, well, what do you want to do? You'll be fasting, be tired. No, they all fasted. The entire village confessed the night before. And I said, well, do you want me to do it simple? They said, we want everything. Everything you can possibly do. So we did a full hierarchical Divine Liturgy in the village. We blessed the graveyard and the 4 sides of the church. Then they had native dancing in the evening, and it was a beautiful church. But that's still there when you consider all of that history. You can see really the deep piety and faith of these people. So this would be one of the villages that would be kept alive by, of course, readers. There are a number of communities which are 90 to 100% Orthodox, who are not served by a priest but by a reader, and they follow the footsteps of their faithful fathers and mothers. The establishment of St. Herman's Seminary opened the way for native men to be trained to serve in the clergy, and some of our priests have gone on to establish new parishes in Fairbanks, Valdez, Oscarville, this is in the native region, Mountain Village, Naknek, and one of our graduates from St. Herman's Seminary, Archpriest Martin Nicolai, on his own initiative, has taken the liturgy, which was translated into Yupik in Cyrillic, and put it in Latin letters, so that that's used now, so that they could continue to keep their traditions. I wish I had one of my priests here to speak with you. At the All-American Council, Father Vasily spoke about his experience as a priest. That is Father Vasily as a little boy. And he spoke about venerable priests who would travel 200 to 300 miles alone on snow machines in negative 40 degrees temperature over mountain ranges in order to visit parishes. He also mentioned that there were some parishes say to the priest, "You work for God, we don't have to pay you." Sometimes the priest has to finance the cost of actually his travel to the villages. Some of the clergy are tormented by thoughts, if I wasn't clergy, I could provide for and feed my family. He related that one of his brother's priests had to live in a house covered with ice and frost on the ceiling in the wintertime and mold in the bottom throughout the year. Sadly, one of the children developed lifetime health conditions after being exposed to severe cold and mold. By the grace of God, this has not changed the family's faith and love for the church, but it did not inspire his family to follow in the footsteps to serve his sons to become priests. I believe it's imperative that we act now on behalf of our mother diocese, and these are brothers and sisters in the far north. They've been through so very much, and they've suffered greatly, often very, very alone. Our Lord teaches us that all things are possible to him that believes, and I believe this downward spiral can come to an end. I believe that our mother diocese can begin to grow, and that we can do mission work and continue what our saints set out to do with much sweat and tears. And I know, brothers and sisters, you believe this as well. And there are already positive signs, hopeful signs, signs that the church is even growing. In terms of education, we've recently drafted a new curriculum following the principles of St. Innocent with an emphasis on Alaskan-centric pastoral formation and cultural care, reflecting what the natives humbly express as important to them rather than what those outside their culture assume is best for them. At present, we have 8 men in seminary. In terms of communities, some are actively building new temples, and one parish on the road system, Fairbanks, I believe that's Fairbanks, yes, had 40 new converts in 2022. In fact, and it's very cold in Fairbanks, and anyone who knows, it's terribly cold. I mean, negative 40, negative 50, and when Pascha comes, it's still very, very cold. The faithful literally could not fit in the church, and so they were outside of the church, some of them on Pascha night. I've tried to paint an accurate portrait of the diocese. With all honesty, I've shared with you the hardships and the tragedies it has endured, that I might stir your compassionate hearts. Your brothers and sisters in Alaska need your assistance, and only you can stretch out that hand of the Good Samaritan, pouring forth wine and oil on the wounds. The needs are many, and there's no single program sufficient to revitalize the diocese. The diocese needs a budget, but with which to develop programs, and a missionary fund that can enable me to visit distant parishes. The diocese needs to put the lands in order, but a staff of 2 is insufficient to oversee lands and make them what they were meant to be, a means to support the ministries of the church. Parishes without rectories are greatly in need of one. But above all, my chief concern is for my priests with shamefully low stipends. Of all the many needs which I could come before you and ask for help, this is the one that I'm bringing to this blessed parish today. St. Paul once said to St. Timothy, the laborer is worthy of his reward. My clergy deserve a decent stipend. To that end, I asked the help of the All-American Council in Baltimore in establishing a diocesan-wide endowment to supplement clergy stipends. An endowment that replenishes itself would be ideal, for it would ensure continued care for the posterity of my clergy and their families. We can, by conservative estimates, provide our Alaskan rural priests with an additional $80 a month from the interest of an endowment of $1 million. That may not seem like a large increase, but for a priest with a $7,200 a year stipend, it's a 13% increase, raising his stipend to $8,160 a year. It's a tithe, more than a tithe, and certainly a start. In practical terms, this will turn into a warm coat for a child in cold weather, a little more heating fuel for a warm home in below freezing weather, or just some store-bought food on the tables. You know, I go to the villages and they give me everything that they can. But I mean, it's usually, I remember I went one village and for breakfast, I had salmon, and it was very good. And for lunch, but it was Friday. St. Innocent gave the dispensation that they can have fish all through Lent and on Fridays and Wednesdays because there's nothing growing, there's literally nothing else to eat. So, you know, we had Friday. For breakfast, I had fish, salmon, and then lunch, I had salmon, and dinner, I had salmon. And I said, well, this is Friday. We'll see what I get tomorrow. Friday, I had salmon, salmon, and salmon. They did have a store-bought cake or something like that, but those items are very expensive. Those are luxury items, but they also, you know, every mother wants to give her child something else to eat, you know, and other than salmon. I mean, I was 2 days and I was like, okay, I'm ready for something else. They are too. And if it's an endowment, it'll continue for years to come. I believe it's not an unreachable goal. At present, we've actually reached 90% of our goal, $900,000. And actually coming to the Archdiocese of Washington, the Archdiocese actually almost really began, you know, with his beatitude, giving that very generous donation to the Diocese of Alaska and the Diocese of Mexico. I told his beatitude, wouldn't it be beautiful if the Archdiocese of Washington finishes it off, you know, and tops it, that we reach the goal. And he said, well, my people are good and generous. And so these donations have really given hope to the faithful of the Orthodox, that the faithful of the Orthodox Church in America cares for Alaska, cares for these people, and believes that the fund is a way forward. And it demonstrates that the faithful are excited about being part of positive change now, not done by Russians abroad, but by those living here in the North American continent. To repeat the words of Bishop Innocent II to President Theodore Roosevelt in 1907, it's time for the new proprietors to take over not only their rights, but their responsibilities towards us as well. It's time as a church as well. We're all members of the body of Christ. At this point, a member in great need is asking for care from another member that is able to provide that care. With this in mind, we're asking that you please help your brothers and your sisters living lives that would be hard for many of us to imagine. Their parishioners offer what they can, but it's not enough. Help, and they'll be sincerely grateful. There was one soul at the All-American Council that said, well, wouldn't it be good to just give an initial stipend to them? And she actually, you know, wrote a check out for, what was it, $16,000. And so, you know, but the stipulation was this was to be, you know, distributed to the clergy. And so at my clergy assembly, I gave that. And their faces looked radiant. They couldn't believe it. They've actually never received anything from the church except maybe a suspension or two, you know. And it was they were just so very, very grateful, so touched. And, you know, I gave it to them, and they immediately went to the store to buy food for their families that they couldn't otherwise normally buy. I've handed out the flyers and the envelopes. You know, write down the names of your loved ones, those who have fallen asleep in the Lord, those that are in need of prayer, that are struggling, and they'll be read. And also, give what you're able to give. You know, the Lord doesn't ask that we do more than we can do as Christians, but He does ask us to do what we can do. And so, I'm asking for your help on their behalf. thank you so much. You know, goodness and kindness, it has a ripple effect. And I believe the help you provide will do good ways in ways that are far-reaching and for the glory of God. Please be a part of this. Please be that good Samaritan. Please help us lift high the cross of God, of Christ, in the God-protected, beautiful land of Alaska, for those beautiful people who have stayed faithful to Christ under the worst conditions. I thank all of you for your love and support of the Russian Orthodox Diocese of Alaska. Guyana, that's Yupik. Kagasakang is Anangan. And Lachish is Tlingit. And Spasiba, that's kind of easy.